Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Social Mind. My name is Kimron Korean. I am your guest host today, and today I am interviewing your actual host, Lorna Dale Charles. Now, I am not going to ask her to introduce herself because she is the host of this show. You know her. But what I will do is ask her, why are we having this episode where I'm guest hosting?
Hi, Kimron, and thank you for agreeing to be my host today on my show. We're having this episode because I've gotten a lot of inquiries and in conversation, both online and offline with persons. A number of questions came up, and I thought that I should address it, but I needed somebody to host the show. So here you are.
Okay, awesome. And some of the questions that you've been getting, I know you and I have been having discussions offline about them, and I have my own take on it. And so I'm happy that you asked me to guest host because I also get to ask you some of the questions that I want to get clarity on. Now, one of the things that we've been discussing is the society, and I know you got a lot of inquiries from your audience about the society. And one of the things that was discussed is the impact that our society has on our life. And you know, there is a saying that our society shapes who we are. Now, in my mind, I am thinking that yes, while our society shapes who we are, our society was created by us. So in my mind, I'm thinking, does our society shape who we are, or do we shape who we are through our social institutions? So my first question to you is, do we shape our society, or does our society shape us?
Wow. Everything you said is correct. Yes, our society shape who we are, and in turn, we shape our society, vice versa. Now, you mentioned institutions. People are shaped by institutions of society, and it's people who make up these institutions, and these institutions in turn help shape people or help shape us. There's what I would call sociologically a symbiotic relation. Right? For example, the institution of education, the school or the church for that matter, it helps shape us at a very young age, right? In the long run, we make up, as in people make up those institutions. One can think about, I suppose I want to go deeper into the family as an institution. The family's role isn't just for reproduction or procreation, but it's also about the socialization in terms of passing on norms, values to its young, right? So yes, so if we use the family as an institution, we start shaping up the minds of the youngs from a very young age, and as they go out into society in terms of formal education, then the school would help shape that.
Okay. Yeah? Okay, that makes sense to me. I know I mentioned it earlier, and you keep talking about institutions, and the school as an institution, and the family as an institution. And I mean, just looking at, the church is an institution, but then the family is also an institution. Like, what do you mean by institution when we're talking about in the context of society?
Institution or stable patterns of behavior that define, govern, and constrain actions, right? An institution, another way to put it, is an organization or formal structure that governs a field of actions, right? Hence, you have a judicial system. It has a particular role. The family, as I mentioned, has a particular role. The church, again, has a particular role. I mean, the school has a particular role. So those are institutions that has been set up since the beginning of time, right? And we follow these institutions. That's what I said earlier. These institutions help shape our society. But who make up these institutions? We.
Right.
And in turn, we shape who our society or societies are.
Okay. So
I want to probably maybe break it down a little bit.
yeah, I was about to ask you to do that because one of the things I'm hearing from you, for instance, it seems as though, and I could be wrong, you let me know, that there are like formal institutions and informal institutions. Is that what's happening here?
Absolutely.
So can you break it down a little bit more for us?
Right. So when we talk about institutions, generally in any given society, it can be very abstract. Right. For example, when we speak about the family, as I mentioned, the church, or even our legal or judicial system, these things, like as I mentioned earlier, have particular goals and objectives or roles to play in our society. Their aims are very specific. And as mentioned, the family, and I would probably go a lot into that because that's where our early socialization takes place.
Right.
The family performs several essential roles for society. It socializes our children. It provides emotional and practical support for its members. It helps regulate sexual activities and sexual reproduction. And it provides its members with a social identity. So you know you belong to that particular space or that particular group, right? So that's how we can identify the family as an institution. It's not
Okay.
like a physical building as in the church, right? Who makes up the church? The building would always be there. But if nobody goes into the church for that matter, then it's just a building. So
Right.
we, the people, makes up the church. So when the priest or the pastor leaves the church, we are still part of the church. When we go to church, we are the church. Right. So when we think of institution, like I mentioned, we sort of think of it abstractly, particularly as in today's world where we change the school system so that we can change society in terms of an education system, right? One has to be constantly be educated. And as I mentioned, the family takes care of the informal aspect of education. And then we have the school, which takes care of the formal aspects of education. So that's where we learn to read, to write, to develop our critical and analytical thinking skills. That's where we learn to create new inventions or be innovative. That's how our ideas come into play in reality. That's how we are able to sit in a space where we are educated to be able to build roads and bridges and fly airplane. You would not get that type of learning in the home
Right.
system.
Got
Yeah.
you.
So I hope that that's clear
Yeah,
in that context.
that's a bit clearer. That's a bit clearer, at least for me. And now let's just go back to look at the society in its broadest sense. And again, so at the beginning, you said that yes, there is a symbiotic relationship that exists between us and the social institutions. However, and moving away from just the institutions on a whole and looking at society in the broadest context, do you think that there are some things that needs to be changed in our society? And if yes, what do you think some of those are?
Of course, there's things that need to be changed in our society. I mean, can you imagine if we are stagnant still back in the Stone Age and the Ice Age? Right. So
That would be
society,
crazy.
right. So society and people evolve over time, and how we do that, as I mentioned, is the school as an educational institution where I mentioned previously we are taught basic academic skills, knowledge, learning, and our cultural norms, right? So it is a social institution which provides its members with knowledge, including like the basic facts, as I mentioned previously. So education as an institution has that specific role. However, if we are to use, of course, I'll always reference Grenada. If we are to use our Grenadian education system, there is that you asked if there are some things that need to be changed in society.
Yes.
Yes, I would argue here that rote learning, corporal punishment, And I'll explain. Let me go. I would do rote learning. Now, when you sit in a classroom and you are told exactly what to do, how to act, how to think, how to behave. Can you imagine, like, every day, all of us wake up doing the same thing, eating the same thing, right? Because that's what we were taught. So no critical or analytical thinking skills are developed. That's what rote learning does. Because when you get a test or an exam, you regurgitate that and you spit it back out to exactly what the teacher wants. That's part of our education system where rote learning. You are not allowed to question things. That's a problem.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Corporal punishment, and we could go back to the family again in the sense that when you want your child to do something and he or she is not doing that, we take spanking, right? It's a form of abuse and also control. But in our society, we don't see that. We see it as disciplining our kids. Civic education, social responsibility. What does that mean? I suppose I have to put it into context. Now, in all societies, as far as we can remember, from a historical context, we have again those institutions. So let's take colonialism and slavery, for example. When the colonizers or the masters were on the plantations, what did they do when they wanted their slaves to do exactly what they want? There was physical abuse, right?
Yes.
And so that part of discipline, because you want them to do exactly what you want them to do. So when we discipline our children in those ways, because we remember the family's role is to teach us how to act and to behave informally. Yes. So when you start to spank a child, he or she is learning at a very young age, when this person is not doing that particular thing that you want them to do, you exert force, physical force. Sometimes it could be a verbal force as well, right? We need to come to terms. That's one of the things I believe we can change to society, because as we grow older, what tends to happen? We keep doing the same thing that was done to us, that has been passed on to. It's like our heritage,
right?
And as you know, my area of speciality in terms of being an archaeologist is heritage. And I would argue in the past that not all aspects of our heritage was pleasant, and not all those aspects needs to be passed on from generation to generation. Right?
But you will argue that it needs to be known.
It needs to be known, right?
Right.
Right. So that's how these institutions shape our mind, because it tells us what to do. So, like I mentioned, the rote learning, the corporal punishment, it leads to one being abusive in our society. So the same institutions that was created to protect, to love, and to nourish and to nurture, it also has the opposite effect. And there's a way we could probably deal with that opposite effect if we truly educate and we start to ask questions as to why, and do more verbal communication instead of probably a physical one. I hope I would have answered that question.
No, you did. And as you were talking, one of the things that keep running through my mind is, and that might be weird to just think about, but the importance of history and the importance of understanding where you came from. Because you mentioned certain things like abuse and corporal punishment and so. And as you were speaking, you mentioned how the colonial masters used some of those things as a form of control to get, the enslaved people to do whatever they want. And right. One could draw a parallel to the abuse, and so that happens within the institution of the family today. So it appears as though that stemmed from way back then, and we see it happening today. So what I'm saying is the importance of understanding one's history, to know what are some of the things that you want to I would say emulate. And what are some of the things that definitely needs to change if our society is to progress in the way that it needs to, right? So and I know that history is one of the things that you're very passionate about. So I would imagine that you will agree with me on in that it's very important to understand our history and understand, where we came from and what would have transpired before us if we are to progress into the future.
Absolutely. Now, the if we go back to the original, to our very first question, where you asked if society shapes us and in turn reshapes society, and I answer yes. I suppose you're asking, how can we change the society in the way that we want it to be, that we would not experience some of the historical experiences we'd have had that are negative.
Yes, because I
Right?
mean, at the end of the day, we speak about changing society, but I mean, and you mentioned some of the change that needs to happen, but in what ways would that be?
So what we need to do, as you say, history is important. Knowing where we are, who we are, where we came from, and where we want to go. That needs to be your thinking in terms of us changing society for the better. Because society will constantly change. But if you want to make it better for everyone, what we need to do is reflect on what we want and build those institutions of how we want them. For example, if we look at domestic violence, what would be the institution that is responsible or that should be responsible to prevent domestic violence? Right? One could argue the family. Right. One could argue that is a judicial system. I would again start off with the family, because that's where your first stages of discipline comes into play. And as I mentioned, you inherit that, so you pass on whatever you learn, right? And again, institutions are historical, and I just mentioned colonialism and slavery. And it's really about power. So what we do in terms of domestic violence, we want our boyfriend, girlfriend, wife, husband to do exactly what we want, right? And so part of the problem as well is that we see people as things in terms of property. So this is my husband, this is my woman, this is my man. So we see them as property, and we do not value them as a person who has free will, that they can do what they want. They have rights. They are an individual, which means they have a mind of their own, right? Mm-hmm. So how do we fix domestic violence, as I mentioned, for example? We have to go back to all of the institutions that help shape us. And right. One would say that, oh, you need to discipline your children. Of course you can discipline your children, but I'm sure there are other mechanisms that we can use, right? Because I'm sure the colonizers don't physically beat their children, right? It's like I said, it's something that is learned and is passed down to us. So how we fix that is through education, understanding that each person has rights, has freedom. There are individuals. So when we teach in our education system, we need to be able to have the children ask questions. Dialogue is one of the things that needs to be had at a very early age. Sometimes we think that because they are children, they have to do exactly what we say as parents, but they do have a mind of their own. They have an inquiring mind, so they are going to ask questions. When you start having all the conversations and dialogue from a very early age, and so when you get to the stage of having a relationship or a marriage, you are better able to communicate. You would not exert force because it's not something that is in you anymore. right? So it is a conditioning of the mind, restructuring of the mind through dialogue, that understanding that while you would like for this person to do this particular thing and he or she chooses not to, that it's within his or her rights. Not because, for example, you are in an intimate relationship with someone or a marriage with someone, these persons lose their rights. They
Right.
don't lose their rights because you now coexist in a particular context, right? That's how you have, as I mentioned, continuous dialogues. And when we have those, if we do decide to have those dialogues, then that's one way of, I suppose, eliminating domestic violence, right?
I mean,
So
it makes sense. It makes sense.
right. So it's really to reflect on the society that we want. And if we use a church, for example, and there's a famous saying, do unto others as you want them to do
Who
unto
want
you.
you?
And in the
Yes.
same context, they say, love your neighbor as thyself. So would you want to exert pain? Would you want somebody to exert pain on you? And of course, in another context, some persons might say, well, if he doesn't beat me, he doesn't love me. That is a conditioning, because there's different methods and
Yes.
different ways of showing love. So if we learn to understand that through dialogue, we can solve more issues, as opposed to domestic violence, where people lose their life, and then you pass on that trauma from generation to generation. So education, in essence, education is one of the key factors that would help us to shape the society exactly how we want it, and not in turn let society shapes us. Because if we leave domestic violence to keep going the way it's going, in turn the society is shaping us, and not we are shaping the society. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that makes a lot of sense to me, and I really hope that clarified a lot of the questions that some of your audiences had. To me, it makes a lot of sense, and thank you for doing this. Thank you for clarifying and really breaking down how our society functions. And before we go, is there anything else that you would want to add? Anything that maybe you think I should have asked but didn't? Anything you think the people should know?
I think I touched on all the points, because people were really trying to, I suppose, understand society, and sometimes we do it very abstractly, and that's why, again, as I mentioned, history is important. If we understand why we are doing a particular thing, how did we get to be doing that particular thing, then we would know why X, Y, or Z is occurring or happening within our society. So the past is important, and using that past information to help create a more safer space, or innovative and creative space of how you want your country or your society or your communities to grow, right? So what we need to learn is respect,
Right.
tolerance, and valuing each other, and understand that if this thing is causing me pain, if I do it to somebody else, then it's going to cause them pain. If this thing is causing me joy, the possibility exists that I can pass that joy on to somebody. Yeah. So it's really about us understanding where we came from, why we do the things we do, um, respecting and valuing each other. That's how we begin to understand society. That's how we begin to understand ourselves. That would be, I suppose, a takeaway message from the various questions. And I was going to touch on that subject a little bit later into the show, but I suppose since the questions keep coming, I thought that, yeah, I probably need to debunk the direction that persons are, or the ways in which people are thinking, and hopefully that can give them some context into understanding our societies from a sociological perspective, because our sociological understanding can also explain or psychological
Right.
perspective, because there's a very thin line between sociology and psychology, but sometimes we tend to separate it, and really that shouldn't be the case.
Yeah. Okay. No, great. And it makes sense that you're doing it right now, because when you look at some of the past episodes that you've had, you looked at like reflective thinking. And one of the things that was touched on there is, this whole idea that when students are asking, like, let's say, why in the school, you're being told, well, because I said so. People are, even at home, kids ask, okay, well, why do I have to, why and why and why, and that's how we learn. That's how kids learn. But and you spoke
Absolutely.
about the whole road learning, and so even looking at that, and then you spoke about language discrimination in Grenada, and you spoke about it in Belize, and all these things happen within our society. So in order for us to truly, I guess, what I'm saying is this episode is timely, because it comes at a point where you are going to have more deep discussions on a lot of topics that affects our society. So it makes sense to kind of deconstruct the society so that people will have a better understanding as to what they're dealing with as you proceed, and go deeper into other topics of interest within the social mind. So Lorna Dale, thank you for coming on your show and for deconstructing and breaking down a topic that people have been asking you about. Thank you for entrusting me, with this whole mission to be your guest host. And okay, I'm just being just being a fool. But again, thank you for doing that. And to everybody, I hope that there is a greater understanding as to our society, how our society works, and also on the institutions that makes up our society. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of The Social Mind, and we'll see you next week for another episode when Lorna Dale will be breaking down another interesting topic with another interesting guest. So thank you, Lorna Dale, and thank you, everyone. See you next week.